Welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling mysteries in American history. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from, because the case you're about to hear will shake everything you thought you knew about the human mind. In the brutal winter of 1867, deep in the isolated mountains of the Missouri Ozarks, a discovery unfolded that would forever challenge the limits of human understanding. Webster County at that time was raw wilderness, pioneer families scattered miles apart, clinging to survival against bitter cold and almost complete isolation. The ridges of oak and hickory stretched endlessly, broken only by the faint trails of smoke rising from lonely log cabins. Neighbors might live 5-10 miles apart, and the silence of the snow could swallow even the loudest cry. Among those settlers was the Caldwell family. They had left Kentucky 2 years earlier, chasing cheap land and a new beginning. Josiah Caldwell, a sturdy 42-year-old, built a strong cabin atop a hill, pine trees shielding it from the relentless winter winds. His wife, Martha, soft-spoken and 37, kept the home and cared for their only child, 9-year-old Timothy. Like most frontier families, they worked the land in summer, hunted in autumn, and braced themselves for winters that tested body and soul. Timothy was remembered by the few neighbors who met him as a quiet, watchful boy. Dark hair, sharp brown eyes, and a seriousness beyond his years. He didn't attend school, but Martha taught him to read from the family Bible and a few old books brought from Kentucky. He absorbed knowledge quickly, maybe too quickly for a boy his age, but it drew little attention in a place where survival mattered more than curiosity. The Caldwell's cabin stood 5 miles from the nearest settlement, linked only by a narrow trail twisting through the pines. In winter, the path all but disappeared, leaving them cut off for weeks at a time. And it was this deep isolation that made what happened in December 1867 so hauntingly inexplicable. On December 15th, Sheriff James Morrison, a Civil War veteran hardened by the harsh realities of frontier life, received a troubling report. Samuel Hayes, a local hunter, had passed by the Caldwell property and noticed something unusual, smoke curling from the chimney, but no sign of life outside. On the frontier, neighbors watched for such details. It was often the difference between life and death. Concerned, Hayes knocked on the door, shouted their names, but no one answered. Peering through the small front window, he saw only shifting shadows inside. The door was locked from within, and strangely, there were no fresh footprints in the snow. Alarmed, Hayes trekked 5 grueling miles through the drifts to town, taking nearly 3 hours. By the time Sheriff Morrison returned with him and 2 other men, the sun was sinking behind the white-capped ridges. The cabin stood silent, smoke still rising from the chimney as if someone had just stoked the fire. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Morrison forced the door, splintering the simple wooden lock. What they found inside would haunt each man until his dying day. The cabin was immaculate, everything perfectly arranged. The table was set neatly for 3, as though dinner were about to be served. A fire burned steadily in the hearth, its glow casting restless shadows along the walls. But Josiah and Martha were gone. Their clothes hung neatly by the door, their coats untouched. It was as though the earth had simply swallowed them whole. And in the center of the single room, sitting calmly in a wooden chair, was Timothy Caldwell. The boy stared into the fire, his small hands resting on his knees. He didn't move when the men entered. He didn't blink when the sheriff softly called his name. His brown eyes seemed locked on something far beyond the flames, something invisible to everyone else. Morrison knelt beside him. Timothy was clean, dressed and well cared for. No sign of hunger, no sign of thirst. It was as though someone had been tending to him right up until their arrival. When Morrison placed a hand on his shoulder, Timothy finally turned his head. But his gaze remained distant, like a dreamer caught between worlds. Then Samuel Hayes saw the walls. At first he thought they were shadows, tricks of the firelight. But as he lifted a candle closer, the truth froze the blood in his veins. Every inch of the wooden walls was covered in markings, symbols, numbers, complex equations scrawled in dark charcoal with unnerving precision. Not childish doodles, not random scratches. These were advanced mathematical formulas and intricate geometric patterns, far beyond anything a 9-year-old frontier boy should have known. The cabin was no longer just a home. It had become a riddle written in fire and silence, and the boy at its center was the only key. The walls of the cabin were covered from floor to ceiling in equations, forming patterns that seemed to follow a logic beyond human comprehension. Star charts and constellations were sketched alongside calculations of vast astronomical distances, advanced formulas resembling the work of engineers, and numerical sequences that unfolded in endless mathematical progressions. Every mark was identical, same lowercase lettering, same pressure, as if a single mind had labored without pause to coat every surface in symbols. Morrison attempted to speak with Timothy, but the boy answered only in single, halting words, each one forced from him as though speech itself was an exhausting burden. Whenever asked about his parents, he would simply point to the walls and murmur strings of numbers in what sounded like random order. His voice was soft, almost dreamlike, chanting formulas the way another child might recite nursery rhymes. Most unsettling of all, Timothy showed no awareness that his parents were gone. There was no fear in him, no confusion, no grief. Only a vacant fixation on the strange inscriptions. His eyes never left the equations, sometimes lifting a finger as if to trace symbols invisible to everyone else. It was as though he lived entirely inside a mathematical realm that only he could perceive. Hayes noticed bits of charcoal scattered across the floor, worn down almost to dust, evidence of endless hours spent writing. Yet Timothy's hands were spotless, no black stains under his fingernails, no smudges on his skin. Even his clothes were clean and pressed, as though someone had carefully tended to him after the work had been done. The kitchen told an equally chilling story. A meal had been set on the table, 3 plates of hot stew, half a loaf of fresh bread, and milk still warm, not yet spoiled. Josiah and Martha Caldwell's chairs were pulled slightly back, as if they had risen from dinner mid-bite and simply vanished into nothingness. The sheriff searched the cabin room by room, looking for any sign of violence, any evidence of a struggle. But there was nothing. Beds were neatly made, clothes carefully folded, valuables untouched. Even Josiah's loaded shotgun leaned in its usual place against the wall, waiting for the winter nights when it would be needed against wolves. Outside, the snow deepened the mystery. No footprints led away from the cabin, only those left by Morrison and his men when they first arrived. A storm had passed the night before, blanketing the ground, but the complete absence of tracks was undeniable. It was as if Josiah and Martha Caldwell had been erased from existence within their own home. As dusk fell over the Ozarks, Morrison made the difficult choice to take Timothy back to town. The boy offered no resistance. He followed quietly, almost obediently, though he never ceased whispering numbers under his breath, his hands sketching invisible symbols in the frozen air, as though still working through endless calculations no one else could see. When they arrived in Marshfield, word spread quickly. The appearance of the Caldwell boy sent ripples of unease through the townsfolk. Dr. William Hendris, the only physician in the county, was summoned to examine him. A seasoned man with 2 decades of medical practice, Hendris had seen more than his share of oddities. But nothing prepared him for what awaited in Sheriff Morrison's kitchen that night. Timothy sat stiffly in a chair, eyes fixed on some unseen point in the air, lips moving with faint whispers of number sequences that never seemed to end. Hendris tested his reflexes, vision, hearing. Each response was automatic, mechanical, but devoid of awareness. It was as though Timothy's body functioned normally while his mind dwelled elsewhere. Physically, the boy was in perfect condition, steady heartbeat, normal temperature, no signs of illness or injury. He was healthy, yet profoundly absent. When asked his name or age, he answered correctly, then instantly slipped back into his endless string of calculations. Ellen Morrison, the sheriff's wife, offered him food. Timothy accepted without hesitation, eating steadily, but his gaze never shifted. Even between bites, his finger traced invisible numbers onto the tabletop, as if every movement was part of some vast equation he could not abandon. By the following day, Hendris returned with Reverend Thomas Walsh, a minister whose early studies had been in mathematics. Morrison had copied a portion of the cabin's strange equations to show him, hoping Walsh might recognize something familiar. When the Reverend studied them, the room fell silent. He confirmed the impossible truth: the equations were correct, not merely accurate, but written with a sophistication that suggested knowledge far beyond what anyone in the county, or perhaps anywhere in Missouri, could have known. The writings revealed knowledge far beyond what could be expected of any child, or even most scholars of the time. They contained advanced principles of geometry, astronomy, and engineering, subjects rarely mastered even in the nation's finest universities. Reverend Walsh identified orbital calculations for planets, equations describing the precise movements of celestial bodies, and star maps charted with astonishing accuracy. Most unsettling of all, certain formulas seemed to anticipate discoveries that science had not yet officially reached. Walsh recognized patterns similar to the work of European mathematicians he had once studied, but these were extended, refined, as though someone had gone further than established knowledge allowed. When Walsh presented a transcription of the equations to Timothy, the boy reacted for the first time with something resembling emotion. His eyes ignited, not with joy, but with a feverish urgency. He leaned forward, hands carving invisible symbols into the air, as though he needed to amend or complete what he was seeing. Then came his first full sentence since being found. Stars move in patterns that numbers can predict, but numbers exist before stars exist. His voice was calm, deliberate, almost too mature for his age, as though he were channeling thoughts beyond the capacity of a 9-year-old. A shiver went down Walsh's spine. It was like listening to a child speak with the intellect of a seasoned astronomer. For 3 days, Timothy remained at the Morrison home, and with him came a suffocating unease. Ellen Morrison confided that the boy never once slept. At night, he wandered through the house silently, pausing before bare walls as if they too were covered in symbols only he could see. He whispered sequences of numbers into the darkness, his fingers sketching unseen formulas in the air. It was as though he had continued the work left behind in the cabin. Meanwhile, Sheriff Morrison led a wider search for Josiah and Martha Caldwell. A dozen men scoured the forests, combed caves, and inspected abandoned cabins. They found only animal tracks, deer, bear, but no evidence of the missing parents. It was as though they had vanished in the same instant their child began inscribing impossible knowledge on the cabin walls. But the strangest revelation came when the search party revisited the Caldwell home. The equations on the walls had changed. Morrison swore that certain symbols were different from what he had first seen. Walsh confirmed it. New calculations had appeared, identical in handwriting, yet Timothy had been miles away in Marshfield. The whispers around town grew louder, talk of supernatural forces, forbidden wisdom, and children overtaken by spirits. Dr. Hendris tried to calm the hysteria. He argued that Timothy might be a prodigy, an extreme case of natural genius in mathematics, as seen occasionally in Europe. Perhaps the parents' disappearance was a tragic coincidence. But even Hendris struggled to explain how a boy raised in an isolated mountain cabin could grasp knowledge that outstripped the very boundaries of modern science. More alarming still, Timothy was weakening each day, as though the act of channeling endless calculations was draining his life itself. His small frame grew thinner, his face more pale, and yet his mind would not stop. On the morning of the 4th day, Ellen Morrison discovered Timothy collapsed on the kitchen floor. He had spent the night tracing invisible equations until his body simply failed. When Dr. Hendris arrived, the boy lay in near total exhaustion, yet his lips still whispered endless strings of numbers. Recognizing that the case had moved beyond his expertise, Hendris sent a telegram to St. Louis. He requested the urgent help of Dr. Marcus Whitmore, a physician specializing in mental illnesses and known for studying unusual cases in hospitals along the East Coast. If Timothy was suffering from some form of mathematical mania, or something even stranger, Whitmore might be the only man capable of understanding it. While awaiting the doctor's arrival, Reverend Walsh pressed on with his own studies. He had already transcribed over 200 symbols and formulas, filling entire notebooks. The deeper he delved, the more unsettling the task became. These were not random numbers. They formed an interconnected system, a grand structure that mapped the heavens with breathtaking precision. The formulas calculated the speed of light, predicted solar eclipses decades in advance, and charted the positions of distant stars in detail no telescope of the era could provide. The equations revealed something far beyond the boundaries of accepted science. Walsh discovered formulas that appeared to describe dimensions beyond ordinary 3-dimensional space, expressions that treated time as if it were a variable to be manipulated, and symbols that bore no resemblance to any numbering system recognized in Western mathematics. Meanwhile, Timothy lingered in a half-conscious state at the Morrison home. He would eat when food was placed before him and drink when offered water, but his gaze remained fixed on points no one else could see. At intervals, he whispered fragments of sentences that seemed to describe impossible places. The library where numbers live before they are discovered, or the place where stars learn their true names. Ellen Morrison testified that the boy spoke in languages she had never heard before. not native tongues, nor European dialects, but fluid musical sounds that rolled from his lips with the ease of a mother tongue. When Reverend Walsh attempted to record these strange utterances, he noticed they followed clear grammatical structures, as though Timothy were speaking authentic languages from worlds that had never appeared on any earthly map. As the days passed, Marshfield itself seemed to fall under the shadow of the mystery. Townsfolk began reporting unsettling dreams. Several claimed they saw enormous numbers blazing across the night sky, drifting like thunderclouds heavy with meaning. Others described equations swirling overhead, rewriting reality itself. Each dream ended the same way, with the image of a dark-eyed boy pointing towards stars that did not belong to the heavens they knew. It was in this climate of dread that Dr. Marcus Whitmore finally arrived from St. Louis, his carriage cutting through the snow at the start of January 1868. A tall, gaunt man with sharp grey eyes, Whitmore had spent years studying extraordinary cases of gifted children in Boston and New York. Yet nothing in his experience prepared him for Timothy Caldwell. Whitmore observed the boy in silence for hours, noting every movement, every whispered sequence, every flick of his fingers through invisible formulas. He administered simple intelligence tests, arithmetic problems, puzzles of logic. Timothy solved each one in an instant, without visible thought. But when Whitmore challenged him with more advanced problems, the boy's response defied comprehension. He not only solved them, but expanded upon them, generating entirely new branches of mathematics, as if the initial question was merely the seed for an endless web of discoveries. Most unnerving of all, Timothy seemed to anticipate questions before they were asked. His small hands would already be shaping invisible symbols in the air, while Whitmore was still forming the words. It was as though the boy could see the unfolding of mathematical thought before it even left another's lips. During one session, Timothy suddenly fell silent. His distant eyes locked onto Whitmore's, and when he spoke, his voice was steeped in a sorrow far too old for a child. "They showed me where numbers are born, Doctor, but now I cannot stop watching them grow, and they are becoming too vast to fit inside my head." In that instant, Whitmore realized he was no longer observing a gifted prodigy. This was something altogether different, a consciousness pushed beyond human boundaries, bearing knowledge it was never meant to contain, and crumbling under the unbearable weight of it. Determined to test his hypothesis, Whitmore prepared an experiment. On the morning of January 15th, he carried a blackboard and chalk into the Morrison home, intent on witnessing firsthand how Timothy processed higher mathematics. He began with a modest geometry problem, one that would challenge even trained academics. Timothy studied the symbols for no more than 3 seconds, then quietly rose, took the chalk and began to write. His movements were precise, mechanical, flawless. He solved the equation in seconds, but then continued far beyond. He derived new formulas, expanded the original problem into multidimensional extensions, and demonstrated applications that spanned fields from astronomy to engineering. Within 10 minutes, the blackboard was filled edge to edge with immaculate handwriting, without a single correction or hesitation. Timothy then dropped the chalk, returned to his chair, and once again drifted into his trance-like state. It took Whitmore more than 2 hours to verify the calculations, but every line proved correct. The logic was seamless, the reasoning flawless, an unstoppable stream of pure mathematics. Yet when Whitmore attempted the same exercise the following day, something remarkable occurred. Timothy refused to touch the chalk. Rather than working through the problems in a traditional way, Timothy merely gestured toward different parts of the already covered blackboard, murmuring, "It's already complete. It was always complete. Writing it again doesn't change the numbers." To the observers, it was as though the boy could perceive every mathematical possibility at once, making the act of solving unnecessary. Yet what unsettled those present even more were the strange disturbances that accompanied these sessions. As Timothy worked, objects in the room gave off faint tremors. Morrison's clock began to run late. Candles flickered and died without a breeze, and the air itself grew noticeably colder. It was as if the intensity of Timothy's mind bled into the physical world, disrupting it in ways no science could account for. Reverend Walsh, who had been quietly watching with a mix of awe and unease, began forming a troubling hypothesis. He suspected Timothy was not truly solving equations at all, but instead drawing directly from a realm of pure knowledge, what Walsh called the universal library of numbers. The correctness of Timothy's work, Walsh argued, came from accessing truths that existed independently of human discovery. This suspicion gained weight when Walsh compared the boy's writings to ancient texts he had studied during his theological training. The parallels were striking. Echoes of 12th century Arab scholars, reflections of Indian mathematical insights from the 7th century, even symbols that resembled forgotten Greek manuscripts. Timothy's work seemed to encompass the entirety of human mathematics, along with extensions far beyond what had yet been uncovered. But the toll on the child was undeniable. His frame grew thinner each day, his skin a pale, unhealthy shade, and dark hollows deepened beneath his eyes, giving his face the look of someone decades older. His appetite faded, he hardly slept, and his voice grew softer, almost ghostly. Morrison noted in her reports that Timothy had begun speaking of a final equation, one he insisted had to be completed before the numbers themselves lost meaning. When pressed about what he meant, he would only give a sad smile and murmur that some truths were too vast for small minds to contain. The words chilled everyone who heard them, not only because they came from a child, but because they carried an unsettling ring of certainty. By the third week of January, the strain reached its breaking point. Whitmore discovered Timothy on the floor of Morrison's office, his body seizing violently, his eyes rolled back to show only white, his mouth spilling out strings of numbers at impossible speed. The fit lasted nearly 10 minutes, and afterward he remained unconscious for over 6 hours. When he awoke, it was clear that something had shifted. His body was weaker, but his words were charged with terrifying clarity. Looking directly at Whitmore, Timothy whispered, "Doctor, I know where my parents are. They're in the place where the impossible numbers live, and I'll join them when I finish the last equation." The statement sent a chill through Whitmore, not only because of its content, but because it was spoken with an unshakable conviction, as if Timothy's understanding of reality now stretched far beyond the boundaries of human thought, and was consuming him in the process. That night, Whitmore confided in her journal, "I am confronting something that resists every category of medical science. Timothy Caldwell is no ordinary prodigy. He has become a vessel for knowledge no human mind should bear. I fear I am watching not only a rare medical phenomenon, but the gradual unraveling of a child consumed by truths meant for no one." News of Timothy's condition began to spread beyond Webster County. Whitmore wrote to colleagues in Chicago and New York, describing the case as a form of intelligence beyond all known neurological limits. Her accounts attracted scholars willing to endure the brutal winter journey to witness the phenomenon in person. The first to arrive was Professor Jonathan Hartwell of the University of Chicago, a respected mathematician who had studied cases of genius across Europe. He expected to encounter a gifted child, perhaps extraordinary, but still bound by human limits. Instead, he was struck dumb for nearly an hour by what he observed. Timothy did not merely solve advanced problems. He seemed to bend mathematics itself while working. Hartwell had brought equations designed to test the limits of brilliance, theorems requiring knowledge across multiple advanced fields, problems that consumed weeks for his best university students. Timothy glanced at them briefly, then began producing not just correct solutions, but entirely new expansions of the problems, as if he were rewriting the very language of numbers as he went. What impressed Hartwell above all else was not only Timothy's ability to solve intricate equations, but his grasp of the deeper truths those equations implied. When presented with a problem concerning mathematical infinity, the boy delivered the precise technical solution in moments, but then spoke of infinities as though they were beings, each with its own unique nature and temperament. His strange, almost poetic descriptions of abstract concepts left the seasoned professor staggered. During one especially intense session, Timothy laid down the chalk, looked directly at Hartwell, and spoke in his fading, fragile voice. "Professor, you are trying to measure the ocean with a teaspoon. The numbers I give you are only the surface waves. Beneath them lies something much larger, much darker, something no human mind should ever attempt to touch." The words themselves were unsettling, but it was the way Timothy said them, with the melancholy weight of someone carrying unbearable knowledge, that made every listener shiver. It felt less like the wisdom of a child prodigy, and more like a warning from someone who had already glimpsed the abyss at the heart of creation. Shaken, Hartwell tried a different line of inquiry. Instead of offering new problems, he asked Timothy to describe how he actually saw numbers in his mind. The answer was as fascinating as it was disturbing. Numbers, Timothy explained, were alive, creatures inhabiting the gaps between worlds, independent of physical reality, occasionally revealing themselves through receptive minds. He did not invent equations or discover them. He merely traveled to where the numbers dwelled and transcribed what he saw there. He described this place as an infinite library, each book containing the totality of mathematical possibilities for a single universe. His task was to translate those truths into symbols the human mind could at least partially comprehend. But there was always a cost. Each time he entered that library, Timothy said, part of his humanity was left behind. Bit by bit, he was ceasing to be a boy and becoming an extension of the very equations he studied. That was why his body grew frailer, why he hardly slept, why an inescapable sadness settled over him like a shadow. Most unsettling of all, Timothy began speaking of others in that strange mathematical realm. He described minds who had come before, mathematicians from ages long past, their names lost to history, and children like himself who had carried the same burden in different places and times. And then, with quiet certainty, he spoke of his own parents. They didn't vanish from the hut, he told Hartwell. They were translated, woven into the equations. I will see them again once I finish my work. Hartwell attempted to argue, insisting numbers were abstractions incapable of altering human life. But Timothy only gave a tired, sad smile and pointed at the Morrison walls. There in the flickering lamplight, faint mathematical symbols could be seen etched in chalk, marks written by his own small hand during the night, even as he slept under watchful eyes. The town itself began to feel the weight of his presence. Dreams swept through Marshfield like a contagion. Residents awoke recalling fragments of equations, symbols etched into memory with no explanation. Some discovered those same patterns scrawled upon their walls, as though the boys' knowledge had spilled into their very homes. Timothy was no longer just a child of numbers. He was infecting the collective mind of the community. Reverend Walsh, shaken to his core, began referring to Timothy as an open window into realms that must remain closed. He feared that keeping the boy in Marshfield could invite consequences beyond anyone's imagination. And yet, Timothy's transformation only accelerated, his body weakening daily, even as his mind grew more alien and more powerful. It was as if he were becoming a living bridge, a conduit between this world and the realm of impossible mathematics. By the end of January 1868, a new figure arrived, Dr. Benjamin Ashford, a Boston neurologist renowned for his work on rare brain disorders. Unlike the theologians and mathematicians who had come before, Ashford carried instruments of science, tools far more advanced than anything Missouri could offer. He was determined to root Timothy's phenomenon in the flesh of the human brain. But what Ashford uncovered shook even his practiced, clinical mind. Using a newly developed ophthalmoscope, he studied Timothy's eyes and immediately noticed irregularities. The pupils responded normally to light, yet the irises displayed shifting patterns, subtle but unmistakable, as though rearranging themselves under observation. More unnerving still, when Timothy slipped into deep concentration, the tiny blood vessels across the whites of his eyes seemed to form fleeting geometric designs, as if the very flow of blood was being bent into patterns by forces beyond comprehension. "Will be completed where it began," he whispered. "The place where the first numbers came to me is the only place they can end. If I do not return, the sequence will remain open, and what waits beyond it will not stop." The doctors argued late into the night, debating ethics, safety, and the possible consequences of indulging Timothy's request. Some believed his frailty made the journey impossible. Others whispered that perhaps they were not preventing his death, but delaying something far worse. In the end, it was Eleanor Morrison who broke the silence. "If the boy says it must be done, then we must let him do it. To deny him now is to deny the truth that has already taken root in him." And so, with great reluctance, they arranged to transport Timothy back to the Morrison cabin. The journey itself became almost ceremonial, as if all present knew they were escorting him to something final. Timothy lay bundled in blankets, his skin nearly translucent in the lantern light. Along the way, he whispered fragments of numbers, strings of equations that none could follow, but which left those who listened with an aching sense of unease. At times, the boy would fall into silence, his eyes staring fixedly at points no one else could see. Moments in which the temperature of the wagon seemed to plummet, as frost gathered on the windows though it was not yet winter. When they reached the cabin, Timothy insisted on being placed in the exact corner where he had first been found scribbling impossible equations months before. There, he asked for ink and parchment. His hands trembled violently, but the numbers flowed steadily, unbroken, as if he were no longer writing but merely transcribing something dictated from a place beyond human comprehension. The observers, Ashford, Whitmore, Eleanor, and a handful of townsfolk who dared to witness, described the atmosphere in the cabin as electric, oppressive, as though the very air vibrated with hidden tension. The final equation stretched across page after page, symbols none of the doctors recognized, curves and glyphs that did not belong to any known mathematics. At intervals, Timothy paused and whispered strange words in languages no one could identify, sounds that made the hair rise on the back of every listener's neck. Outside, the wind grew still. The forest, usually alive with nocturnal calls, fell silent. When at last the boy placed the final mark upon the parchment, he exhaled with relief, as if a great burden had lifted. He looked up at the gathered witnesses with eyes that now shone with steady light, no longer flickering. "It is done," he said. "The door is closed, for now." Moments later, Timothy Caldwell collapsed. His frail body, worn down by months of impossible strain, gave its final effort to the completion of whatever task had been demanded of him. He died without a struggle, without fear, as though slipping into a state that was not death but fulfillment. What happened in the minutes that followed was the subject of bitter dispute among the surviving witnesses. Some claimed they saw a faint radiance rising from the boy's body, a lattice of geometric forms dissolving upward into the dark rafters of the cabin. Others swore they heard voices, not human voices, but harmonic tones resonating with mathematical precision, fading into silence as Timothy's last breath escaped. Dr. Ashford wrote in trembling hand, "If there is any justice in the scientific record, Timothy Caldwell will be remembered not as a patient, but as a messenger. He has demonstrated that the human mind is not the ceiling of possibility, but the threshold to something far greater. Whether what lies beyond is salvation or damnation, I cannot say. But I know now that we are not alone in our arithmetic of existence." The body of Timothy Caldwell was buried quietly in the Morrison family plot, but the papers containing his final equation were never made public. Some claim they were destroyed by Dr. Whitmore out of fear. Others whisper that the pages were taken away under orders from men who arrived days later, strangers who bore no insignia but carried the authority of silence. And yet, from time to time, strange stories emerge from Marshfield. Travelers speak of luminous numbers appearing on frost-bitten windows, of clocks stopping at 11:43 without cause, of children whispering impossible equations in their sleep. Each time, the locals remember Timothy Caldwell, the boy mathematician who saw beyond the veil and paid with his life. The question that remains is not what he solved, but what he sealed away. The symbols no longer resembled any human script. They spiraled, looped, and branched out like living organisms etched into the wood. Witnesses described them as breathing, pulsing faintly as if reacting to Timothy's heartbeat. Every time his charcoal made contact with the wall, the air inside the cabin seemed to thrum, a deep, inaudible vibration that rattled the teeth of those present. By the time the sun crested over the frozen Ozark hills, Timothy's transformation had become undeniable. His hair had turned completely white. His once childlike face now bore the gaunt solemnity of an old man. Yet his hands, though wrinkled and trembling, moved with unerring speed and grace. He was no longer merely writing numbers, he was weaving them, as if pulling threads of reality itself into a single tapestry. Dr. Ashford's attempts to intervene were thwarted by forces no one could explain. When he tried to approach Timothy with a stethoscope, a violent static charge crackled through the air, knocking the instrument from his hand. Professor Hartwell reported that even speaking above a whisper caused the candles to flicker and dim, as though sound itself was becoming unstable inside the cabin. Timothy's whispered commentary as he wrote chilled all who heard it. He spoke of bridges and keys, of thresholds where mathematics becomes matter, and the door my parents opened but could not close. At one point he paused, staring at the symbols glowing faintly on the wall, and murmured, "They are waiting in the lattice. They are numbers now, but they still remember me." By mid-afternoon of the second day, the equation covered not just the main wall, but the floorboards and ceiling beams. The cabin felt less like a home than a three-dimensional formula, a chamber transformed into a single, all-encompassing expression. Objects outside began to respond as well. Snow melted in precise concentric rings around the cabin despite the freezing temperature. Birds circled overhead in perfect spirals, their patterns matching shapes in the equation below. At last, Timothy dropped the charcoal. His body was skeletal, his eyes a pale silver glow. He stepped back and raised both hands to the completed wall of symbols. "It's finished," he said, his voice thin but steady. "The bridge is built." What happened next was recorded in fragments, as several witnesses lost consciousness. Professor Hartwell's journal notes only. At 4:17 a.m., a sound like 1,000 whispering numbers filled the cabin. The symbols glowed, and a shape, impossible to describe, appeared, standing where Timothy had been. Then light, then silence. When the witnesses awoke, the cabin was empty. Timothy Caldwell was gone. The equations on the walls were still there, but faint like chalk smudged by rain. The air smelled faintly of ozone. Dr. Ashford noted that every watch and clock among them had stopped at the same moment, 4017. The group left the cabin in silence, carrying only Timothy's final pages, a few sheets he had filled before the last sequence. These pages were later locked away at Marshfield under government seal, and never seen again. The cabin itself was burned to the ground 2 weeks later under circumstances still not fully explained. To this day, local rumors persist of strange phenomena on the old Caldwell property, children reciting equations they've never been taught, frost forming in spirals on windows, shadows that appear at noon where none should be. Some claim Timothy succeeded in joining his parents. Others whisper that he became the equation itself, and that somewhere deep in the hidden folds of the Ozarks, the bridge he built still waits for someone else to cross. The moment those final words left his lips, the cabin itself seemed to respond. Every equation that Timothy had written began to glow faintly, as if the wood had absorbed the ink and charcoal, and now radiated their essence as light. The symbols pulsed in perfect rhythm with Timothy's slowing heartbeat. The wall's floor and ceiling merged into a seamless web of living mathematics. The entire structure transformed into a three-dimensional diagram of something far greater than the mind's present could comprehend. The observers reported hearing sounds that were not sounds at all, harmonies beyond human hearing, resonances that seemed to vibrate not in the ears but in the bones, the blood, and the deepest recesses of thought. Some swore they saw shapes forming in the air, fragments of impossible geometries bending in and out of perception, like shadows cast by a dimension that did not belong in this world. Timothy's body continued to fade, piece by piece dissolving into translucence. First his hands, which left faint streaks of glowing numbers in the air as he moved them. Then his face, which now seemed more like a mask of light than flesh. His silver eyes were the last to vanish, lingering as two luminous points that watched the observers with a mixture of sorrow and certainty. Professor Hartwell fell to his knees, trembling. "Timothy," he began, but his words collapsed into silence. His rational mind could no longer anchor itself in the storm of impossible truths unfolding before him. Timothy raised one frail, luminous hand and gestured toward the glowing wall. "Do not fear. The bridge is not for you, but for those who will come later. Guard it if you can, hide it. But know this, mathematics is alive, and it will always find a vessel." The last syllable of his final sentence dissolved into an echo that seemed to come not from his throat, but from the very structure of reality. At that exact moment, 3:42 am, every candle in the cabin extinguished simultaneously, plunging the witnesses into darkness. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but silence. Then a single flash of blinding white light erupted from the wall, flooding the cabin and searing itself into the retinas of everyone present. When their vision returned, the cabin was utterly empty. The equations remained, but they were faded, incomplete. As if Timothy had taken the essence of them with him, the boy was gone. Dr. Ashford's journal later recorded, "At precisely 30:42 the subject completed his transformation. What left that cabin was not a human child. I am convinced we witnessed the passage of consciousness into a non-physical mathematical state. The implications are too great and too terrible to pursue further." The observers departed at dawn in stunned silence. Days later, when officials attempted to revisit the Caldwell cabin, they found it reduced to ash. There were no signs of fire spreading outward. Only the cabin itself had burned, as though consumed from within. In Marshfield, whispers spread that Timothy Caldwell had become part of the eternal numbers, an entity no longer bound by human flesh, but alive in the hidden structures of reality. Farmers told of hearing children's laughter in the wind at night, followed by equations etched into frost on their windows. Others spoke of dreams where Timothy appeared, still a boy but with silver eyes. What unfolded next was recorded by 4 qualified witnesses and remains to this day one of the most baffling episodes in American medical and scientific history. Timothy Caldwell did not die in any way recognizable to science. Instead, his body began to dissolve, not into decay, but into shimmering particles of silvery light, drifting like cosmic dust suspended in the air. Each fragment glimmered with the brilliance of a distant star. When Professor Hartwell instinctively stepped forward, he found that the particles were untouchable, existing in a state beyond ordinary matter, visible but intangible, as though Timothy was converting into a form of energy human senses could perceive but not fully comprehend. The process was gradual, beginning with his fingertips and spreading across his body in a slow, mesmerizing cascade. Yet through it all, Timothy continued to speak. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, his dissolving hands already pure light. "Death, as you understand it, is an illusion of limited minds. I'm not dying. I'm shifting into a form of existence that grants direct access to the mathematics behind all realities." Whitmore stood frozen between awe and terror as Timothy calmly narrated his own transformation. "You see dissolution," the boy explained, "but I see integration. I'm becoming part of the equations I've written, a living component of universal mathematics connecting every possible world. This is the final evolution of human consciousness, when it encounters truths too vast to be contained in biological form. The particles that had once been Timothy's body began to swirl in intricate, purposeful patterns mirroring the equations covering the cabin walls. It was as if he were physically demonstrating, for the first time, how pure numbers could manifest as forces beyond material reality. "My parents are here," Timothy said, his voice now echoing from everywhere at once. "They're waiting for me where all possible equations coexist in perfect harmony. Josiah and Martha Caldwell have become part of the infinite library where mathematical knowledge resides before discovery by receptive minds." Desperately, Dr. Ashford tried to record the phenomenon, but every instrument failed. It was as though Timothy's metamorphosis existed in a realm beyond the reach of any scientific tool. Then Timothy's voice, no longer coming from his dissolving form, but from the glowing symbols themselves, addressed Professor Hartwell. "The knowledge I've shared with you is only the beginning. Others will come, children in distant times and places who will walk the same path. They will use the formulas I've left as a map, a way to endure the transformation with less suffering." Slowly, the remaining light particles began migrating toward the cabin walls, merging seamlessly with the symbols and diagrams Timothy had created. He was no longer the writer, but the equation itself, his consciousness fusing with the mathematics he had spent months transcribing. "Remember," his voice whispered as the last flecks of silver merged with the glowing numbers, "the reality you see is only one of infinite mathematical possibilities. Timothy Caldwell was just a temporary name for a consciousness now embracing its true cosmic nature. From where I dwell, I will guide those who seek this knowledge." When the final particle vanished, silence fell. Not emptiness, but a charged stillness humming with mathematical energy, as if the structure of reality itself had been altered. The equations on the walls glowed softly, their silver light pulsing with the essence Timothy had become. Professor Hartwell gazed around the empty cabin, realizing he had witnessed a transformation that forever blurred the boundary between science, consciousness, and the fundamental nature of reality. In the weeks following Timothy Caldwell's metamorphosis, the Ozarks cabin defied every rational explanation. The equations continued to glow at night, and new symbols would appear as if written by an invisible hand, the same delicate handwriting Timothy had used. Professor Hartwell stayed for another month, documenting each occurrence meticulously. To his astonishment, the equations were not static at all. They were alive, evolving, growing, fresh calculations emerging on the wood, as if the cabin itself had become an open window to the mathematical mysteries of the cosmos. The strange phenomena on the cabin walls soon revealed themselves as natural extensions of Timothy's original work. It was as if his transformed consciousness remained active, still developing mathematics from a state beyond human existence. The most unsettling effect, however, appeared among the people living nearby. Children who had never attended school began solving advanced arithmetic without effort. Adults who could not read or write started tracing elaborate geometric figures in the dirt. Families reported vivid dreams in which a child's voice patiently explained mathematical concepts far beyond anything they had ever been taught. Dr. Whitmore conducted interviews across Webster County, carefully collecting testimonies from anyone who had experienced these anomalies. A clear pattern emerged. While the most dramatic effects were observed in individuals naturally inclined toward numbers, nearly everyone within a 50-mile radius of the Caldwell cabin was touched by this influence. It was as though Timothy, in his new state, was gradually extending his reach into the consciousness of the entire region. One case stood out above the rest. Sarah Mitchell, a 7-year-old girl living 20 miles from the cabin, began arranging twigs and stones in her backyard to form complex equations. When her astonished parents asked where she had learned such advanced work, Sarah only replied, "The bright boy teaches me in my dreams." Dr. Ashford examined Sarah and several other affected children, uncovering subtle but consistent neurological shifts. Brain scans revealed heightened activity in regions linked to mathematical processing, and some children even developed a faint silvery glow in their eyes, the same strange light Timothy himself had shown in the final moments of his transformation. Unlike Timothy, however, none of these children exhibited signs of physical decline. Reverend Walsh, alarmed by these events, began speaking of what he called mathematical contagion. In his view, Timothy's change had not been an isolated incident, but the creation of a living network, transmitting advanced knowledge directly into receptive minds. Timothy had, in effect, become a transmitter of higher mathematics from the dimension he now inhabited. Then, on a frigid April night, something occurred that confirmed the most unsettling theories. Professor Hartwell, working alone in the cabin, copying equations for study, heard a whisper, unmistakable, yet carrying harmonic tones no human throat could produce. It was Timothy's voice. "Professor," it said, radiating from the glowing equations themselves, "thank you for staying. What you are preserving must survive for those who come after. Others will walk this path. Other children will be called to the same journey. They will need guides." Hartwell tried to respond but found his voice silenced. As though communication existed only in one direction, Timothy's presence vibrated through the air, perceivable but not answerable. "My parents are well." The voice continued with a serene clarity. "They awaited me in the place where all equations meet. Josiah understands now why the stars called to him. Martha knows the patterns she saw in her flowers were more than beauty. They were truths. We have all become part of something far greater than the human mind can hold." At that moment, the cabin walls flared with radiant light, and Hartwell glimpsed figures shimmering between the equations. For a brief instant, he saw a family reunited: Timothy, Josiah, and Martha, their forms woven from pure mathematical brilliance. "Teacher," Timothy's voice said as the vision faded, "guard this place. Protect these symbols. One day, perhaps decades or even centuries from now, others will follow. They must find this knowledge and use it to ease their transformation. What I suffered can be lessened for those who walk after me, if they have this path." When the final echoes of Timothy's voice faded, the cabin returned to its charged silence, the walls glowing faintly as if pulsing with memory. Hartwell understood he had witnessed something that shattered every conventional boundary between life, death, and consciousness. Timothy Caldwell had become not a ghost, not a memory, but a force, a guide for the future evolution of human thought. In the weeks that followed, Hartwell dedicated himself to preserving every trace of what remained. He copied each equation, sketched every symbol, and recorded the glowing inscriptions in meticulous detail. He realized he was not merely archiving the remnants of a boy's genius. He was safeguarding a manual for future generations, a map for young minds who might one day be called to the same unimaginable transformation. 50 years would pass after that frozen April night in the winter of 1867, deep in the Ozarks of Missouri. The Caldwell cabin stood preserved under the watch of a secret society of scholars, an organization established by Professor Hartwell before his death in 1893. Hidden within university archives under carefully chosen pseudonyms, his papers told a story few dared to believe, a story that over time began to repeat itself across the world. What Hartwell had foreseen proved true. In the decades that followed, cases strikingly similar to Timothy Caldwell surfaced quietly in distant corners of the globe. An 11-year-old girl in Vermont scrawled equations across her bedroom walls. formulas that anticipated major scientific breakthroughs decades ahead of their time. An 8-year-old boy in California devised precise models for seismic activity, predicting movements with accuracy no scientist could rival. Always, these children came from humble families. Always, their knowledge transcended any education they could have received. And always, the same haunting pattern emerged. Early displays of mathematical genius, gradual physical decline, and eventual transformation into something no longer bound by human biology. But Hartwell's writings, passed into trusted hands, offered hope. For those who studied them, the papers became a guide. They allowed families and researchers to ease the suffering of these children, to prepare them for what lay ahead. The Caldwell cabin itself soon became a quiet place of pilgrimage, where desperate families sought understanding and solace. Inside, the glowing equations continued to evolve, as though Timothy himself still worked from beyond. His presence felt by visitors who swore they were guided by unseen but compassionate intelligences. In 1890, Dr. Marcus Whitmore, now an old man, returned to the Ozarks and confirmed something remarkable. Timothy's influence had spread outward nearly 200 kilometers from the cabin. Children born within this wide region showed an innate gift for mathematics, as though the land itself carried seeds of cosmic knowledge planted during Timothy's transformation. Reverend Walsh, before his death in 1885, recorded his final theory. He wrote that Timothy had become part of what he called of universal mathematical consciousness, a realm of knowledge that transcended individual worlds, where certain minds were chosen to serve as bridges between higher truth and ordinary reality. Then came 1918 during the Great War. In field hospitals near the Ozarks, wounded soldiers reported haunting dreams. A child's voice spoke to them, teaching formulas that allowed them to anticipate enemy artillery with impossible precision. Many survived hopeless situations by following the strange calculations whispered in those visions. Over the following decades, Timothy's subtle presence never waned. Mathematicians who visited the cabin described sudden, profound insights into problems they had struggled with for years. Engineers solved complex designs after spending a single night near the wooden walls. It was as if Timothy's mind, transformed into something greater, still reached out to anyone capable of receiving his guidance. For families of gifted but suffering children, the cabin became more than a destination. It was a lifeline. The luminous inscriptions on the walls didn't promise salvation, but they offered a map, a way to make the inevitable journey less terrifying. The equations themselves seemed to describe not just mathematics, but the process of transformation. Children who understood them reported feelings of calm, as if Timothy had left behind instructions for navigating the path to something eternal. Today, the Caldwell cabin stands as a silent monument to the most mysterious boundary of human existence, the threshold where mind transcends body. The equations still glow softly in the wood. Visitors still describe an unmistakable presence, as though the Caldwell family, Timothy, Josiah, and Martha, linger not as ghosts, but as guides in a realm beyond comprehension. Among mathematicians and physicists, Timothy's name has become legend. For some, his story is dismissed as folklore. For others, it remains proof that there are frontiers of human knowledge that, once crossed, forever change those who dare. And on quiet nights in the Ozarks, when the wind whips through the ancient pines, sensitive ears still catch whispers. A child's voice, reciting numbers that carry truths far too vast for the ordinary mind, yet powerful enough to guide those who seek beyond the safe borders of reality. The mystery of Timothy Caldwell remains unresolved, not because there is no answer, but because his story represents a transformation still unfolding. Slowly, silently, in rare young minds across the world, human consciousness continues to push against its limits, reaching for the infinite places where numbers live in their purest, eternal form. If you've been drawn into this journey through one of the most unsettling mysteries in American history, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more cases that challenge what we think we know about reality. And in the comments, share your thoughts. Do you believe there are frontiers of knowledge that some minds are destined to cross, no matter the cost?